Hello, my name is Melissa Conley-Tyler, and I'm an honorary fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. I am broadcasting today from the land of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Indigenous people who might be joining us tonight. Thank you for joining us for this seminar looking at how learning Asian languages changes your worldview. We're excited to be having a fantastic audience. I understand 178 people have registered, so thank you for that level of interest. And we have a great panel of people who we're going to take you through today. So we have teachers and learners of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Arabic, and Indonesian who are going to take you through a little bit about their own experience of how Asian languages have changed their view. I suppose from our perspective, there's a worry sometimes that when we talk about Asian languages, the primary narrative we talk about is all instrumental. It's all about employability and jobs and work. And I actually think a lot of people aren't motivated by that. They're motivated by other factors. So you'll be able to hear tonight a little bit about what motivated these people and how they found it's enriched their lives. And this webinar is coinciding with the release of a new issue of Melbourne Asia Review, which is the Asia Institute's publication. And to introduce us to the work of the Asia Institute and to this special issue of Melbourne Asia Review, I'd like to call on Jun Ohashi, who is the Japanese study convener at the Asia Institute and the editor of this excellent special issue. Over to you, Jun.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jun Ohashi. I'm invited editor of the current issue, edition 13, which is looking into sort of exploring the educational value of Asian languages, which has been sort of associated with the boosting employability. So if you learn Asian languages, you can access to growing sort of Asian economy. Therefore, you have more opportunity to find jobs and so on. So we kind of challenge that kind of common sort of discourse with a lot of evidence. Learning the Asian languages more than that. So if you associate the employability and Asian languages, you are underestimating potential educational values. So there are lots of contributors clearly give us evidence that Asian languages are more than that. And so we invited the number of panelists, teachers, and also the educators, academics, and also the user or learners of Asian languages to share their view. So over to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Jun. So I just want to introduce the wonderful panel we have to speak to you today. So we have Dr. Bohu, who is a learner of Japanese and a teacher of Chinese, specifically my teacher of Chinese. So thank you very much, Hu Lao Shi, for coming tonight. We have Associate Professor Edwin Urians, who is a teacher and learner of Indonesian. We have Jasmine Barrett, who has learned both Korean and Chinese. And we have Penny Vakalopoulos, who has learned Indonesian and Arabic and has just started teaching beginners Arabic. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. So my first question, I suppose, is a pretty simple one. Why did you start learning this language and why did you stay learning it? So Jasmine, can I start with you? Why did you start learning Korean and why did you stay learning it?
Thanks very much, Melissa. It's lovely to be here. So I started learning Korean when I was 12. It was one of the languages offered at a public school here in Melbourne, McKinnon Secondary College. The other languages were French and German, but my parents told me that they thought Korean would be the most useful. So I listened to them on that occasion. I don't often listen to what my parents tell me to do, but that time I did. And I stayed learning Korean. I traveled to Korea and fell in love with the country and the people. And then I just didn't have a reason to stop. There was nothing telling me to stop learning Korean, so I just kept going with it.
Fantastic. And over to you, Edwin. Why did you start learning Indonesian and why did you stay learning?
Yeah, I think from a very early age, I was really committed to learning about culture, language, literature, and art. And at secondary school, my favorite subjects were Latin and French. I was also exposed to Dutch and English and Greek and German. And I think it also helped that my parents took us on holidays to different parts of Europe, particularly France. My older sister also decided to study French literature and then ended up living there and raising a family in the country. But I think with my general interest in Dutch and other literature, I really wanted to expand my horizon and try to have access to different corpora of books and ideas and learn about other countries and peoples. At university open days, I went to sessions of Italian and Chinese and Korean and Arabic, a few more. But I think the choice for Indonesian really came from early friendship at kindergarten and primary schools, where I met children with Indonesian heritage, other Indonesian connections, and I was fascinated by their stories, their cuisine, other aspects of their culture. And this is linked to the close relationship between the two countries because of the Dutch colonial past. So studying Indonesian gave me the opportunity to travel, but also a way of better understanding Dutch culture, language, history, everyday life. And interestingly, only now, almost 80 years after Indonesia's independence, there's a strong intellectual and public debate about revisiting the colonial past and promoting decoloniality in the Netherlands. And also elsewhere around the globe. For instance, there's a lot of heated discussion about return of cultural objects from Western museums to the countries of origin. And I think, yeah, just for many, this may come as something completely new, but I think I'm quite blessed to say that perhaps with my, at that time, rather unusual study choice in a small specialist program, with our group of students and teachers, we already had a chance to discuss and build some understanding about some of these issues in the early 1990s. So really happy with my decision to study Indonesian at uni.
And so that kept reinforcing by the sound of it. Okay,
Yeah,
well, over
yeah.
to you, Bo. Why did you start learning Japanese and why did you stay learning?
Thank you, Melissa. Hello, everyone. My name's Bo. And so my journey of learning Japanese came in quite late in my adult life. I had the opportunity to choose to learn Japanese when I was at the university, but I chose to learn German rather than Japanese. And so I never thought I would learn Japanese until my first trip to Japan back in 2014 with my sister. So she initiated a trip to Japan after her university here in Melbourne. And I said, okay, why not? So I traveled to Japan with her. And instantly, I think that's just this journey of learning Japanese just pop up with this critical trip or life event. So after I came back from Japan and I signed up a Japanese language school right here in Melbourne CBD, and I never stopped. I think fundamental reason is I just want to, because the trip was so fundamental, I was, just impressed by how structural the society is and the high standard service in hospitality. From a tourist perspective, I just felt like, I have to learn this language to be able to fully enjoy my tourist life in Japan. Yeah.
Okay. Well, over to you, Penny. Tell us about Arabic and why you started and stayed learning it.
Yeah, so it actually all started with Indonesian in almost over a decade ago now in school, and then Indonesian led me to Arabic. And there was never a kind of clear vocational goal or utility in my mind for either of these languages. It was something that I kind of just threw myself at without really asking why. But I think retrospectively, I can probably say that the appeal was aesthetic and cultural and even emotional. Like there's a kind of energy that Arabic and Indonesian express to me that reflects a certain cultural energy that I find quite appealing. And language learning for me is a bit like a love affair. The draw card is often the aesthetics or the acoustics of the language. And so, for example, the first time I was exposed to the sounds of Arabic in real time, I was actually in Indonesia. I was living with a family in a small village in Java. And this was like 6 years ago. And it was Ramadan, and I would hear them recite the Quran. And so that was 6 years ago. And as a nice synchronicity, I'm currently in Morocco as we speak, and it's Ramadan again 6 years later. And I'm surrounded by Quranic recitation again. I'm not sure if the audio is clear, but you might be able to hear my host mum. She's currently reciting the Quran in the other room. So yeah, it was that's kind of my loose trajectory. The sounds kind of drew me in, and because they reflected a certain cultural charm. And I think once you're in, and particularly once you travel to these countries, it's kind of hard to disengage. I think, in my experience, the charm just endures. I'm sure others can testify to this, Edwin, in relation to Indonesia. Doesn't matter how many times you go, there's always, you know, the novelty doesn't die, and perhaps it's because it's not novelty, it's this deeper charm. So that's, yeah, it was never a vocational or instrumental thing for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that sense of curiosity is really coming through so well. Fantastic. I might stick with you for a moment, Penny, just to give us an example, you know, from Arabic, I think, on, you know, how learning has changed your worldview. You know, what's an example of something that just made you think, oh, they see the world very differently?
Yeah. I mean, it's been over a decade, and I think both of these, with Arabic, it's been probably 6 or 5 years, and I think both of these languages have transformed me, and I say that with the full weight of the word. I think it is possible to learn a language kind of half-heartedly and not really let it affect you on a deeper level. But these languages have been the kind of backdrop to a decade of intellectual and personal development for me. I mean, that's the general kind of impact that I can speak more about. But to give maybe a specific example drawn from Morocco, I'm sure you all know that Morocco is famous or perhaps infamous for its culture of hospitality. And there's a particular way of conceptualizing the foreigner and the visitor, and more generally the individual in relation to society and the culture. And this is reflected in their language. So to give an example, when I tell Moroccans that I'm visiting, that I've come all the way from Australia to the other side of the globe, and that I've effectively come solo. I mean, I'm not alone now, I'm living with a host family, but I've come, you know, alone. And the response from Moroccans is often a word miskin or miskina for the feminine. And this exists in Indonesian as well, miskin, but it's got more connotations in Arabic. So miskin means, in this context, when it's a response to news of your travel or you coming as a foreigner, it means poor thing. So imagine that you tell someone, I'm traveling, I'm from Australia, I'm here in Morocco for the holidays or whatever. Oh, poor thing. And in our English mind, that doesn't really click. Why would they be pitying me? It's like this well-meaning pity. But if you unpack the word a little bit, it's related to 2 verbs. It's related to quite a few verbs, but 2 that I want to kind of highlight. One is tamaskana, which means to become poor, to kind of lose your house of sustenance, let's say, that, and what that involves, your shelter and your food and your home and your family. But it's related to another verb as well, askana, yuskinu, which is to shelter and to provide board and to provide a space of sustenance. So packed into this one word, miskin, poor thing, is the notion that as a traveller, I've been, the immediate observation of the Moroccans is that I've been severed or separated from my family and from my home and from my community, which is something to be pitied in a well-meaning way, because I've become poor in a sense. But then equally in the same word, there's this impulse on behalf of the Moroccans, and this relates to the other verb, askana, to provide you, to kind of rectify this state of isolation or wretchedness, you know, poor thing, by providing shelter and by providing a substitute family and home and community. And of course, miskin is always followed by marhaba, or in modern standard Arabic, marhaban bik, which means welcome, like you're welcome here, you know, this is also your home. And this is, so I think, I mean, from our perspective, it's, you know, when you hear that people are traveling, it's like, oh, the independence of the traveler is glorified. It's like, how fantastic, you're traveling alone and you're having incredible experiences. And this is all true, of course, but I think the emphasis in the Moroccan mind is that you've left your home. So that's the first observation, you've left your home, and so you're pitied in that sense. And then you're welcomed into a new space, into a new home. So that's one example.
And that's so revealing, isn't it? You know, so much of a worldview in just a couple of syllables.
One word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I might turn to you now, Bo. So from your perspective, can you give us an example of how learning Japanese has changed your worldview?
Thank you, Melissa. I think this answering this question actually is very relevant to the question I just saw in the chat box. It's audience John Chatterton asked me, has learning Japanese changed your perspective on your first language? If it has, it definitely. I think I'll combine Melissa's question with John's question. So we know, I think the concept of high context culture and low context culture. I think compared to English language, Chinese language is already very high in context, a lot of things left unsaid. It's really up to the people who in that speech community to interpret those unsaid messages. But after learning Japanese, I realized this concept, high context culture and low context culture is very relative, and Japanese culture, I think compared to Chinese, probably is even higher in context. One example is...
Maybe we should just explain to audience members, because I know we've got a very wide group, a little bit more about what we mean by that. In some cultures, much of the way you interact with other people is set by the context. So, the words you use for, say, an older person or a younger person are set already. Yeah. Whereas in a low context culture, it's much more a matter of negotiation. Yeah. So, for I don't know, say an American, I might say, oh, who would like to go first? Would you like to do this or you like to do that? There's a negotiation around it because there aren't preset rules. Can you add any more to that, Bo?
Yes, exactly. And to give example, if in a let's say Australian household, if you visit someone says, oh, do you want a drink or coffee or tea? If you want coffee or tea, you just say coffee, please, or tea, please. That's culturally very appropriate. But in the Chinese culture, I assume also in Japanese culture, and we would refuse first. We would say no, but that means no. And if the host insists a few times, that no eventually would transform into a yes. So if you, in that culture, if you would say no, you would still serve us a cup of tea or coffee. But in the low context culture, because I said no, people would take the meaning no, okay, you end up with nothing. Okay, so by learning Japanese, for example, use the example of how to refuse an invitation. I noticed in Japanese language, they don't even use the word no that much compared to the Chinese culture, who will already don't use the word no that much. And for example, when you're trying to say, oh, sorry, I can't make to that party you proposed, you would say choto. Choto in English translation, it means a little bit. So in Chinese, we would say 不好意思. That means I feel very embarrassed, or the Japanese equivalent is sumimasen. But in Chinese, we have a negative word there, 不好意思. So 不好, that's a negative, 不 is a negative word there. But in Japanese, although linguistically, Japanese language do have that word no, which is ye, but people don't use the word no. They would say choto, it means a little bit. It's all dependent on the context and your facial expression. And that just made me reflect on my native language, which I already am so familiar with. And we noticed, wow, by comparison, probably Chinese language is a lower context language. Yeah, I hope I've answered both Melissa's question and John's question.
Perfect. No, and thank you, John. We love people who are putting questions in. So can I encourage other people, please do start putting your questions in. I've got a couple more questions for our panelists, but we want your questions. We want it to be very, very much a discussion. So I think I might turn to Jasmine next. So can you tell us a bit about how learning Asian languages has changed your worldview?
Absolutely. Learning Korean, I've just developed a much deeper understanding of the people and the culture than I otherwise would have. There's some untranslatable phrases, or you can translate them, but it needs quite a bit of interpretation to get the true meaning. So I just wanted to give you one example, which is 금강산도 식후경. which means before visiting Mount Kumgang, you must eat, which obviously requires some interpretation. It's basically saying Mount Kumgang is the most spectacular mountain in Korea. So even before going to visit this amazing place, eating is even more important than that, which basically means anytime you have something very important to do, it's important to do it on a full stomach. You can't start an important business negotiation without first sharing a meal together. And I think that goes to emphasize the importance of bonding over a shared meal and the importance of food in Korean culture. I'd just add that, yeah, the reason I've learnt Korean and I've stuck with it and I've learnt Chinese is because of the people. I just love talking to people, and I love talking to grandmas and grandpas and people who have diverse life experiences that I just would never get the opportunity to hear from and to converse with if I didn't speak their language.
Okay, well, I'll go to Edwin. How about you?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I think my answer would be similar to Jasmine's. And I think in the promotion of language studies, there's often a very strong focus on the ability to speak, to be able to produce verbal sentences as fast and fluent as possible within the shortest learning period of time. But I think this is a very pragmatic, utilitarian, and perhaps rather superficial approach to language and culture learning, because I think a more important outcome is how to become a better listener. And this is not just about hearing and translating words. It's also about understanding people's body language and gestures and feelings and emotions, ideas within the relevant cultural and socio-political context. And I think the interesting thing is that studying Indonesian has not only provided me with physical mobility, visiting places, but also with this unique opportunity to have different types of social and cultural mobility. And I think the advantage of being a newcomer or relative outsider is that, especially in a highly hospitable society such as Indonesia, is that people often share with you opinions and feelings they would never be able to tell to their colleagues or family or friends or community members. So yeah, similar to Jasmine, I've had the opportunity to switch between so many different worlds and learn from so many different conversation partners, authors and artists and journalists and teachers and taxi drivers and housewives, all with very different professional, linguistic, cultural or social backgrounds. So yeah, for instance, I've been exposed through the reading to the work of literary authors from West Sumatra. For almost a year, I spent many nights at radio and television studios in Bandung, learning from journalists and program makers. I think now for almost 30 years, I've been surrounded by visual artists from Yogyakarta and West Java who've given me insights into the arts, but also religion and ethnicity and politics, environments, challenges of everyday life. And just to conclude with one quick example, just before the pandemic, environmental artist Tisna Sanjaya from Bandung took me on a boat trip on a highly polluted river, the Citarum River in West Java. And this is obviously experience that a normal tourist would never have. And I think that view from the river was really enriching to notice the communication or the lack of communication between the artist with his work and his mediating role, the military involved in cleaning operations, the local community struggling with a lack of waste disposal facilities, the polluting textile factories, the NGOs with their campaigns. And I think, yeah, I mean, to have an experience like this, just this bodily experience, this physical experience, combined with the communication and the ability to have some understanding of the language and the culture, really provides a much more comprehensive understanding of a local problem, but obviously also with global implications.
Fascinating. And I think that's a great point that both you and Jasmine have made. It's not just about discovering one worldview, it's the multiplicity of worldviews that are available to you once you can communicate with people in that language. So thank you. So look, I think I'll go to my last question, which is very similar to yours, Georgia. Thank you, Georgia Smith, for your question. And do keep the questions coming, please. I wanted each of you to tell our audience members why they should be learning an Asian language. And I might start with you, Penny.
Yeah, I mean, I hope I've touched on some personal reasons already, but I think if I had to give a perhaps more pragmatic example, I would say, learning Asian languages aids meaningful travel and meaningful tourism. I think it's easy to travel to places without kind of really fully inhabiting them and really connecting with them, and to just kind of be a tourist floating in transit in a world that's kind of constructed for you as a tourist, like the touristic infrastructure surrounding you, rather than being in a place that's not contrived for you. It's simply the reality of those who live there full time, and you're a visitor that needs to be hosted rather than a customer who needs to be served. And so to become integrated in this way, in a meaningful way, I think knowing the local language is kind of an essential part of it, to whatever extent that is. I mean, you don't have to be, we were talking about this before, you don't have to be a master of the language. Even just to have an inroad in with a couple of phrases is always appreciated. And I think the tourism industry would be a lot more meaningful and edifying if language learning was a central part of it. So that would be my incentive. Travel, meaning, and that doesn't mean you have to constantly be traveling, but when you have the opportunity, obviously it's going to enrich it to a great extent, having the language.
Absolutely. Well, over to you, Bo.
Thank you, Melissa. I can definitely relate to what Penny just said about that concept of meaningful travel. And I think that's a really good starting point. So of engaging with another language. I think learning a new language for me is to establish a relationship that I would never had before learning that language. And because of learning that language, I started to get to know how people in the Japanese society think about things. That just provide me with another perspective of seeing the world. Although sometimes I feel definitely the outsider, in the Japanese society. And I think probably, while I'm traveling, the most comfortable scenario is just me not talking, just walking down the street compared to actually Australia. But having a bit of Japanese proficiency, I can definitely easy to get around. However, I still find it's that depth of the culture is very hard to understand. And so, I'm just saying, I think the ultimate reason for me is just about building a new connection with a group of people. Otherwise, you wouldn't have. And I think it's fine if you learn language from an instrumental perspective. For example, when you travel, when you want to speak that language, that's instrumental. But I think if you want the language learning to be more sustainable, you definitely need that socio-emotional aspect of learning that language, not just, getting around. Particularly if you speak English as your first language, English is the lingua franca. Subconsciously would have that privilege of, everyone speaks English these days. I think for English speakers, it's even probably more important for them to learn another language to see the alternative options of worldviews and values. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll go to Edward next. What do you tell audience members of why they should be learning?
Yeah, thanks. I think 1 or 2 years ago, we actually had a conference which was titled Citizens of the World. And this focused on the history and also the future of Indonesian language and culture teaching and learning. And I think really what we try to do is to nurture a new generation of students who not only have a deep understanding of Indonesia, but are also able to present themselves as cosmopolitans on the world stage. So people who really engaged with and also are able to provide very nuanced and informed perspectives on all the important issues of our times. So from climate justice to poverty alleviation to gender equity. And I think the important thing here is that by studying a language, you enter a field of area studies. And this is a very difficult, very challenging, very complex field of studies. But I think that's exactly what you should expect from a university education. So this is by definition interdisciplinary, and it gives you a door not only to linguistics, but also to cultural studies, political science, sociology, history, art history, religious studies, etc. And yeah, I think then you can learn to truly broaden your horizons by looking, for instance, at political issues through the lens of language or culture or religion, or to look at economic problems from the perspectives of ethnicity or social class. And I think, yeah, all of this makes something like Indonesian or Asian studies really difficult to describe because it's never fixed or definitive. But it's also exactly what makes it so exciting for students, because they can make their own unique contributions to the field. And again, also present themselves as really well-rounded, sophisticated, interesting individuals, professionally, but also socially.
And who doesn't want to be a well-rounded, sophisticated individual?
Of course.
Okay. So Jasmine, how about you? What would you tell audience members?
Thanks. So I know it can feel very daunting, or it can feel like a big step to take on another language. Certainly, when I was 29, I moved to Beijing, and I felt like, oh no, I don't want to learn Chinese because I've already struggled so much with Korean and Spanish, and I've given years of my life to these languages, and I was hesitant. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into. But once I started, completely changed my mind, and learning Chinese is just the most fun and probably the least pressure. I was at a different stage in life, so I was just really able to enjoy it. And obviously living in Beijing, it just made my experience so much richer and more rewarding. So it can be very daunting, but I would just say, give it a try, and that you can always say, okay, now I've tried it, I'll stop. But, I think 9 times out of 10 people just fall in love with it and keep going. So just give it a go. Yeah.
And of course, Jasmine has made me feel very old. I started learning Chinese when I was 51, for what it's worth. And for me, it was just as COVID struck. And it was my way to survive a Melbourne lockdown, and then a Taipei lockdown, and then another Melbourne lockdown, which was just there. And I suppose for me, you want to put it in the simplest possible way, life is better when you're learning rather than when you're stuck in the same day over and over again. So I'll take that. Now, I want to answer the first question on our list, which was advice for people who need to learn a language, for instrumental reasons. They need to speak to relatives, partners, family, secondment at work, but you do want to ignite that deeper inspiration. And I thought if I could, Jun, I might go to you, because I know there's some really interesting material in the Melbourne Asia Review edition on the difference between why people start learning and then why they stay learning, and that they can be really quite different things. So can you take us through a bit on what the research says helps people stay learning?
Yeah, definitely. So our article with the co-contributor, actually the first author, Hiroko Ohashi, did look into the blog site and online community. They're talking about sort of motivation of learning Japanese language. And certain population are sort of basically interested in linguistically. I love the language. Yeah, always a certain population just love language regardless. And the some do struggle, and the many of them actually came to the world of learning Japanese through anime, manga, and of this popular Japanese culture. And some kept studying, some dropped out. So one of the factors, just they go on studying, keep on studying, is actually a constant sort of sense of accomplishment. So whether you have the constant feedback from someone, okay, I'm doing good, like by using the learning sort of application, like Anki, so to check your understanding and testing all the time. And so those, or some people actually try for Japanese language proficiency test. So they are the kind of gauge of their sort of sense of growing or getting better at learning Japanese. And still they drop out. But another factor is actually the community. So once they have a friend or some kind of like-minded person to study together, they actually keep studying. Like those who met or made a Japanese friend and form a community, and they just kept on studying the language. So there are three factors. Actually, this is a kind of come from the theory of self-determination theory in psychology. So there are three factors. So the key will be the relation and connectedness is the key to continue on. I don't know how the other contributors would agree or not.
Anyone want to come in on that? Bob?
Can I jump in, Lisa? I completely agree with what John just said. On that question about, one of the audiences asked about the utilitarian reasons, for example, speaking to older relatives or partners or families. Actually, to me, that's just not instrumental. Not just instrumental, because you are families, you have connections, and there's a socio-emotional reason to that, language practice. And as June said, if you have, very closely, very close, for example, for me, Japanese, speaking friends, that could actually make me feel more motivated to learn the language and to maintain that connection. And yeah, so that's my comment on that. Yeah,
what John has said as well.
Yeah.
Well, if I can, I might move on to a question we've got both from John and from Stephanie, which is really around what are the barriers. We've given a very positive view so far because we all love learning our Asian languages, but we know that not everyone in society is sharing that. So do people want to share what they think might be some of the barriers of either Australians wanting to or being able to study an Asian language? And unmute yourself if you'd like to start us off.
I've got two in mind. I think one is a little bit more personal. I think expectations are often too high or not realistic. I think that a lot of people go into language learning without realizing or without maybe being honest to themselves about how much it actually does take to start really understanding and start using a language. And so I think some of the old school virtues, I think I would say discipline and patience, even if you're not at it every day or even every week. Patience. I mean, it took me years before I started to feel like things were clicking in the languages that I learn. And yeah, I think sometimes we have this model of the breadth subject in languages at universities, which is great because it gives a taster, but I think some people think that they're going to pick up a language on the side. And my experience has been that it has been kind of it's been a principal occupation, and it doesn't have to be, but I do think that particularly if you're not immersed in the language on the daily and you don't have the cultural feedback surrounding you, that some discipline is required. And I think it might help them overcome some barriers in terms of personal expectations if they are honest with themselves about that initially, obviously depending on how far you want to go. Another barrier.
Get absolutely instant gratification. Fair enough. It is, as you say, it's something that takes time and patience.
How long a child requires of constant immersion and live feedback from a family that is dedicated to his language development to acquire his first language. It's a matter of years and years and years, and to be proficient in it as well. And so even though we come to it as adults, I think the difficulty is being like, oh, we're adults and we want to express our intellectual development through this language that we only know a few words in. So dealing with that, I think, is the personal one of the personal barriers. And just a quick note on something a little bit more pragmatic, I think funding, I mean, I've been very lucky. I've had a lot of funding come my way to pursue Indonesian and Arabic through travel as well. But I think if more funding was around surrounding these languages, and also more travel opportunities being offered, scholarships for travel, exchanges even at the primary and not the primary, maybe the secondary level of school. Like I was very lucky to engage with an exchange to Indonesia during high school, and I think that even if you're not there for long, that really kind of turbocharges your motivation. So those are the two barriers I would touch on.
Who else wants to come in?
Lisa, can I come in about the Stephanie's question about the barriers to Australian learning another language at a school setting? So when we talk about, the students, the dropping numbers of students, in Australian schools learning languages at, particularly secondary school level, it's multiple reasons to that. I think because if you take the language for exam reasons, that's not a good, incentive to learn that language. And you can easily get demotivated if you can't, keep up, with the curriculum. And given that Australians' language policy on, languages other than English is not very consistent. And some students learned, a second language for multiple years. When they change the school, when they move to another year level, and they stop, having that options. And also, Australian government invested a lot of, money to languages based on trade volumes, which is very pragmatic and utilitarian reasons. And so by the change, because, the world is changing, and this year that you might do more business with one country, and next year you do, business with another country more. And so you allocate those resources and fundings to different languages. And however, learning a language takes time, takes years of constant, learning and effort and interacting with people speaking that language. And you can't just change the policy and, withdraw the funding over the night, and you expect students to be interested, have that consistency in learning that language. I think there's multiple reasons to it when we talk about why Australian students not learning another language.
Yeah, if I may add, I think another problem is that the language learning might be very much limited to, to one specific class, maybe 2 hours of Indonesian studies at school. And I think the problem is that the broader curriculum should have much more Asia-related content as well. I mean, it doesn't really help if students only are exposed to 1 hour of a language a week. But then they go to a history class and it's all Western focused history, for instance, or they go to some other class, and again, there's nothing about Asia at all in that class. I think it really should be an environment where Asia studies becomes normalized, because in the end it's part of our global society. It's very much part of Melbourne society, very multicultural society. So I think that's one thing. The stimulus should come from many more subjects, and from of course, and it's another issue also with the media. But this is something that we try to do at university level as well, that our Indonesian studies is not limited to our program, but there's colleagues in history or in political science or in the sciences even, who also have an interest in the country, who do take their students on exchange, etc. And then it becomes much more organic. It becomes a normal part of everyday life and of study. And I think that's quite crucial. And it's also a resource, and it's a resource, for students learning about Asia. I mean, Melbourne has so much to offer. Just go to events, to exhibitions, to performances, talk to people. From there, start reading some articles, pick up a few keywords, I think that's a very important resource. So we're very, lucky to be in a place like that.
No, I agree, Edwin. And maybe I'll get people to continue on that, because we have a couple of questions from Emily and from Aulia, which is really about, what are some of the methods? What are some of your top tips for learning Asian languages? As Penny says, it takes patience, but it also takes technique. So hearing a little bit about tools that you've used, in both cases, they say that these are considered difficult languages. And I'm interested whether people would agree on that. So Jasmine, do you want to start us off on that?
Great question. I guess one of my tips, what I found very helpful for me was living with a host family. I know that's not an option for everyone, but if you possibly can spend time with a family, which is, very appropriate for younger learners, that was really helpful for me. So what I used to do is I'd be the first one to come home. I'd finish my university classes, and then I'd go home, and my host mother was the only one at home. So we would have a chat, and later my friends started remarking that I sounded like a middle-aged lady. So I must have been picking up the pronunciation and the manner in which she spoke. And so that for me, that was a wonderful compliment. If you can find someone who has the time to really listen to you, then you get the opportunity to listen to them. You just use your ears and that you say what they say.
Fantastic. Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that with some of their techniques and tips?
I think to have like a dialogue between the different skill sets. So you've roughly got reading and writing on one hand, and you've got listening and speaking on the other. And I think you often see people who are proficient in one or the other, and not in the other. So you see people who can write and read really well, but might not be able to speak, and vice versa. And I think if you create a dialogue for extra reinforcement, so for example, and this is not to advocate only, I think there's this romantic idea that you just listen and speak and you watch movies, and that's great, but I think there also needs, like I said, discipline and pushing discipline. There also needs to be a little bit of discipline if you're not constantly immersed. There's only so many YouTube videos you can watch. So, if you've got to kind of create a dialogue yourself between what you listen to and consume in terms of media or movies, or living with a host family or traveling, and then also kind of reinforcing it through practices of writing and reading. And then for me, the words that stay with me and the phrases and the expressions and the structures that stay with me are the ones that I've written and read and then heard, for example, from my host family here in Morocco, or who I'm lucky enough speak to me full time in formal Arabic, which is actually quite rare because most Arabs speak their dialects. So yeah, it's that's one technique, focusing on the different skill sets.
Well, I'll take those. That's some good ones. I feel I really want to answer a question that came up from down recently, which is saying, essentially, in the time of ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence, do we see the necessity of language learning disappearing? I'd love someone's views on that. I don't know if you want to come in, Jun. Would you like to come in on that?
Totally undermining the potential and sort of human connection, and the sort of widening overview, accessing the new ideas, all these possibilities. So language learning actually defeats the meaning of, the tool, what they call ChatGPT. So definitely, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't think language learning is at all threatened by these technologies. Real language learning, it depends how you obviously conceive of the purpose of languages. If you think it is more instrumental and utilitarian, it's about translating words from words, and fine, we've got these technologies that can do that. But language learning on a deeper level, in its full capacity, is I don't think ever going to be threatened by a technology that doesn't have human sentience, in my opinion.
We learn the language to connect, yeah. So this is we never forget.
Yeah. Well, continuing with that, if I can, for a second, we've got a question from Tiranaji Jayatilaki, who is particularly focusing on experience of learning languages outside the country. So you were saying, Bo, for example, that you've been learning Japanese primarily in Australia. I mean, what's been different in doing that and how have you found it?
I think that's touched upon that classic abbreviation NTC, which is called need to communicate. So when there's no need to communicate, we can very often feel demotivated. Let's say Penny lives, with Arabic speaking host family, and there's definitely a need to communicate, for a lot of reasons, instrumental, family connection, emotional, and these reasons connected because there's the need, no matter what that need is, can be instrumental or emotional and social. But learning language outside of that country, I think it's very hard. Definitely it's very hard. And for example, Jasmine learned Chinese in China. That's a wholesome experience, coming without learning a language. It's not just a language in language classroom, like what we do here. But I think that's the hardest part. But in order to kind of complement this, situation, I would say, for example, many languages, Asian languages, are labeled as community languages in Australia. That means they are not actually foreign to Australia. We have, let's say, Chinese-speaking communities, in Australia, and we have, Italian-speaking and Greek-speaking communities here. If we could use the local resources, the diaspora community resources to facilitate that target language learning could be very beneficial, and to create that need. Yeah, I think that's something we
Jasmine's going to
do.
come in quickly, and then I'll move to our next one.
Thanks. Yeah, just very quickly, I recognize that it's extraordinarily difficult to learn the language outside of the country, and I've had the benefit of living in the places where the local language is spoken. But having come back to Australia, I've found that being able to find a fun way to engage with the language has been really instrumental for me. So I used to watch the Korean dramas. So these are serial TV programs, and they're created in such a way that as soon as one episode ends, you just can't help but want to watch the next one. So they're addictive. And when you get home from, long day and you're exhausted, watching TV can be really enjoyable. No. So if you're able to find something like that you find fun, whether that's listening to pop music because you really enjoy that, or another way, if you're able to just enjoy it and just focus on the fun rather than focus on the learning, that can be just enough to get you over that difficult patch where you don't have that need to communicate, as Bo said.
Right. Now, I'm conscious we still have so many wonderful questions, and I want to get through a few more of them. There's quite a few in here which I think are related to how do you promote this. And I'm conscious some of you here are also teachers, so you have to explain to parents or colleagues or whoever it is, why should you learn this Asian language? So we have questions around what sort of arguments do you use to persuade people? What sort of videos or readings might you use? Particularly in an environment which is very competitive, where there are other languages which are also after funds and resources. So who'd like to respond on that one?
Well, it is very difficult to convince mothers and fathers in the school children, because they tend to think the investment, like if they sort of spend a lot of time in learning the language, what will be the return? So they would probably sort of seek tangible return in a short sort of turnout period. But the language learning is not like that. So I don't know how effective that my explanation will be. But once the school children invest in some time in learning, so at some point they find themselves that they gravitated towards learning, They find lots of rewards and fun and friendship and accessing to new thinking. So I don't know to what extent it's effective, but I'm sure that the other participant can help me in that.
Yeah, maybe if I may, Melissa. Well, one thing really, I mentioned area studies before, but one thing to emphasize is that students, they can combine a lot of different subjects and majors and minors. So if they do a language, it's not the only thing they will be doing. They can combine it basically with everything else they want. But this combination makes them quite unique. It can set them apart from other students who only focus on one area and do not have this combination with language and culture studies. So that's one thing. And I think also in terms of skills, I mean, we also talk about transferable skills. It's not only purely about proficiency in a specific language, but it's communication skills. It's about the ability to work in a multicultural environment. I mean, this is something that's not limited to language studies or an environment where language studies as such is important, but it opens up a whole new world, and it's relevant to all different types of profession, from government jobs to business to the cultural sector, museums, tourism, media. I mean, it's an endless list where there's always a demand for people with the humanities, social science background, with the language skills. It's really a foundational skill that goes way beyond knowing how to say something in a different language.
Thank you. And
can I add
very quick one? Absolutely, Patty.
Oh, okay. Just to return to what I started with in this conversation, the aesthetics of the language. I think if we focus on beauty, I mean, there's few of us that aren't touched by beauty. And I know that sounds like, what does that even mean? I mean, the beauty of the language, the aesthetics, using the music, using the visual art, the culture in the classrooms, for example, to incentivize. And you've kind of got to seduce your students a little bit, I think. And I think that can go a long way.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I find that interesting because in the comments we have some which are much more prescriptive. Should we be having as a prerequisite for uni entry? Should we build it into vocational education? Do we need our politicians to be learning and improving their language proficiency? And I actually say that is happening. If you look at the number of cabinet ministers at the moment who are actively learning an Asian language, it is very, very heartening. So I will leave those questions with us to mull over more. What I'd like to do, just to go round with our last question, is there's a question from Saida Kubota, which is says that given the ways that learning a language has changed your worldview, oh gosh, sorry, no, I have got the wrong questions. I apologize, Sarah. I like yours, but I did have one I was going to finish on, which is Ashton's one. Apology. Has the things that have changed in your worldview through learning Asian languages, how has that influenced how you conduct yourself in your more familiar culture, country, or native language? And I was just conscious about myself. I found one of the things that changed for me is I have much, much greater understanding of what it's like to have a limited knowledge of language in Australia. Beforehand, I think I'd made lots of assumptions about people being able to sort of understand English or get by or whatever. I now think we should all communicate much more clearly with a lot more pictures and a lot less words to try to get through to our diverse multicultural communities. But can I just go around the room and ask people to respond to that? How has the change in worldview influenced how you conduct yourself within your native culture? And I might start with Bo and Jasmine.
I think for me, I don't think by learning Japanese, I would behave in a Japanese way in any sense. But I think, acquired a different way of behaving and talking and interacting in different social settings, especially with Japanese speakers. And I think by learning this language, I just acquired this extension of myself. I think I extended myself to a certain degree, not necessarily, changed how I was, but just a kind of like an add-on value to my own self. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I do note Sarah's question, which I'm responding to better now, whether that can actually become almost a hybridized thing. So to you, Jasmine, then to Penny.
Thanks. Yeah, just briefly, I think it's really helped me understand and listen, become a better listener, particularly when I speak. The purpose of this is to try to communicate something, but there's so much misunderstanding and confusion that happens every day in our interactions. So I think it's just made me a bit more perceptive as to how does the other person hear what I'm saying? Am I saying it in a way that's going to make people confused, or am I doing a good job at getting my message across? And then just being a good listener when I'm in an interaction with someone,
whichever language you're working in.
Yeah.
Penny.
I probably would have to think a little bit more about this question. I'm not sure specifically how it's changed my conduct. I'm sure it has. I just haven't reflected on this particular. But I think just going back to what I said in the beginning, that it's changed my understanding of what it means to be an individual in relation to the community. And that has a whole host of ramifications that I won't go through now. It actually formed a part of the subject of my honours thesis that I wrote last year. So yeah, these what sound like esoteric concepts do have real life manifestations from the smallest to the highest levels. Yeah.
Thank you. And Edwin, just a last thought from you.
Yeah, I think, this is the age of social media. People are extremely opinionated. Communication goes super fast. But I think, just to refrain yourself from that and try to not to jump to conclusions too fast, to really try to show empathy, to come to a balanced perception, interpretation, opinion, and really try to put yourself in the position of the other, also taking into account the specific social, political, and cultural context. I think, that's the greatest value for myself.
Thank you. Now, Ewan, I know we're right on time, but I noticed that there are a couple of questions in here from Fatma Angita Putri and from an anonymous attendee who are actually asking about Asia Institute courses. So I should absolutely, as we are promoting the wonderful work of the Asia Institute, give you a moment to answer those before we clog off.
Well, I definitely will suggest that to visit our website, and we do offer Japanese and Chinese, Korean and Indonesian and Arabic languages. So all the information are available. And just in relation to Edwin's sort of final notes, I do agree that starting the learning the language, well, regardless of Asian languages or European languages, you become a foreigner, you become outsider of the society. So you're constantly sort of observing what's happening and always thinking about, like Jasmine said, that am I saying the right thing, or do they interpret correctly, and so on. Monitoring yourself, and that actually sensitize sort of yourself, and that's kind of very, very reflective, sort of constant monitoring is happening.
Thank you.
Then, so you will become sort of conscious about being yourself, and also you start sort of treating outsider in your country in a positive manner. So you try to think their behavior, their meaning in their terms rather than in our terms. So this is a beauty of intercultural learning. This is the kind of skill and the understanding required to tackle the 21st century issues.
And you can hear we've tried very hard to make the case of why there are so many reasons, other than just the instrumental one, why we should be learning Asian languages. I hope you have enjoyed today's discussion. Please do go to the Asia Institute website. Particularly, go and have a look at this excellent edition of Melbourne Asia Review, which is looking at language learning. And I hope you'll join us for other forums. So all I really need to do is thank our fantastic panel, to thank Jun for the idea of doing this event, Annalise for making it all happen, and to our wonderful panelists, to Penny, to Jasmine, to Bo, and to Edwin. Thank you so much all.